When the good Lord begins to doubt the world, he remembers that he created Provence. These were words by Frédéric Mistral, a famous poet from Provence. The south of France has long attracted artists and creative types who were inspired by its light and natural beauty. Vincent van Gogh followed his dream to Arles and saw vortices in the sky. Paul Cézanne returned to his beloved Aix-en-Provence after time spent in Paris. Paul Gauguin accepted Van Gogh's invitation to head south and participate in Van Gogh's artists' colony. And Picasso, whose brush wended its way through the Riviera towns and villages, loved Provence so much he chose to end his days there. Cotignac, a beautiful village just a hop and a skip from Aix-en-Provence, and only an hour into the hills from Saint-Tropez. It's a microcosm of Provence which continues to attract and inspire artists. Tucked away at the foot of an impressive tuff cliff whose caves have been used as refuges, Cotignac is an authentic and lively Provençal village offering crafts, markets, local produce and a glorious summer and a fantastic theatre and cinema festival.
Here we are in the Mairie in the centre of Cotignac, and beside me is the newly restored version of our very own sword Excalibur. This was excavated in the chapel Saint-Martin, which was the original part where the village developed. The sword itself and the chapel date from the 12th century. And behind me is a painting by Ursulac, which he painted in 1964. And by repute, he gave it to the municipality to pay some of his land taxes. Ursulac was an avant-garde painter in the early part of the 20th century. He spent much of his career painting in Paris, and he had a bit of a reputation in the village, which we'll explain all about later on.
Here we are at the back of the Place de l'Église, the St. Peter's Church, which is 13th century in Cotignac. And at the back in the side chapel there is the Cercle des Arts, which is an exhibition space which is run by the Mairie of Cotignac. And it allows both amateur artists as well as professional artists from the local area and internationally to show their works here.
Ils peuvent louer cet espace pendant une semaine ou plus et pour très peu d'argent. Et voilà, on met tout à disposition, les cimaises et les lumières. Et voilà, et c'est assez connu cet espace depuis une vingtaine d'années ou 30 années. Ça sert comme lieu d'exposition.
Et les fenêtres, qui
Alors, les fenêtres sont faites par une collègue artiste. Elle fait du vitrail et c'est son design à elle. Elle les a installés et développés pour le village. Voilà.
Et ça, c'est Dani?
C'est Dani Eli, vitrailliste de Cotignac.
Super. Behind me, you'll see the old olive presses, which were used by the cooperative to press the local olives and produce the wonderful oil that we have in this part of the world. This area is the beginning of the oldest part of the village, closest to the cliff. It's also just behind the Mairie, where earlier on we were able to film the painting by Ursulac. Ursulac was a Serbian painter born at the end of the 19th century who spent most of his career in Paris, and in the 1950s he discovered this part of the world and he bought himself a rather lovely domain with an atelier. He had a little bit of a reputation in the village as he liked capturing the human form in his paintings and drawings. He used to approach some of the younger ladies in the village and ask them to come up to his domain and to model for him. When they got there, he often used to try and persuade them to take off most of their clothes. Recently we had a painting by him in the shop of a lady who was in fact fully clothed. A lady came into the shop to view this particular painting and she said, "Ah, that's a painting of me, painted by Ursulac." And I can tell you that he indeed did try to persuade me to take all my clothes off. Moving on from this part of the village, we're going to go up an escalade, a set of steps, which will take us even closer to the rocher, the cliff, and also to the studio of Jean Arène. Here we are now at the cliff for which Cotignac is so famous. Originally it was actually a waterfall, a river that arrived at the top, then cascaded over the cliff, and then many years ago, about 1200 years ago, the river was somehow diverted, and that's how Cotignac managed to develop here. The original settlement was actually above the cliff, and in fact there were two towers which were constructed so that the inhabitants could see if any invading armies were coming their way. Then the inhabitants actually moved into the cliffs, and you can see some of the holes in the constructions which were put so that they could live inside. And then later on the development went into the lower part of the village, which is where it is today.
Welcome to the back of the village, right up against the Touffe Rock, which rises 100 metres or so up into the air. It's the oldest part of the village and is famous for having troglodyte caves and houses that were built actually into those caves too. This particular area is the troglodyte house and the Atelier Touffe, which is where one of our best known painters from the region lived in the 1960s. Jean Arène was actually born in 1929 in Marseille, but having worked there for quite some time in a group of artists, he decided he wanted to break free and live outside of the city to explore his own artistic style. So he moved to Cotignac. In fact, he came here because at a point in time the Mairie was trying to encourage folks into the village after a particularly hard frost in the 1950s when people left the village, and he was given the house, gifted the house, so to encourage artists and culture to flourish in the area. He's particularly loved by the local people because he painted local scenes. He painted what we could say would be the soul of Provence. He's also responsible for the appearance of Armand d'Avril on the scene. Jean Arène used this Cotignac base to travel the world, and on one of his travels he ended up in Dakar in Senegal in the 1960s and met Avril on one of his tours there and said, "I've discovered this wonderful place at the base of a rock in Cotignac. You must come and live here and explore it with me." And he did just that. So thanks to Jean Arène, we have two wonderful artists in the village.
Here we are sitting on one of the many fountains that you will find in the village. This one is positioned at the bottom of the main road, where you will find all the best restaurants and best shops, including our galleries. It's called Cours Gambetta. During its history, much of the village was actually owned by a religious order called the Pénitents Blancs. They farmed much of the land and they owned most of the existing and exciting buildings. Behind us you will find what used to be their original chapel. When the order was disbanded during the French Revolution, it was put to various uses, including keeping animals, and in the 20th century it was actually turned into the local cinema. More recently it's now been bought by a group of art patrons who've turned it into a gallery space. And every year we're very lucky to have 2 or 3 international quality exhibitions.
This particular exhibition today is called Provence Noire, and it's all about the extreme light and shade in Provence. And there are various local artists that are being exhibited today. Particularly one that we know well is Michel Roux, an old friend of ours that used to live in the village, who does extremely detailed work that looks almost like lace work. It's wonderful. So come along and enjoy this. It's a good hour well spent. Cotignac is a village of fountains, and this is one fine example behind us. And the fountains have been used over many times as inspiration for artists to create works.
We're currently sitting on a fountain which dates from the middle of the 18th century, and as sometimes happens with us as we're travelling around and buying objects, we were lucky enough to actually buy the original design for the fountain.
We hope that you've enjoyed this artistic tour of the village. From this point in the village onwards, you could just enjoy the rock as an amazing sculpture and then follow one of the small back streets back down to the village square and enjoy a coffee. Et finalement, je voudrais remercier le maire, Monsieur Jean-Pierre Véran, de nous avoir permis de faire ce film, de tourner ce film dans ce village extrêmement beau à Cotignac. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le maire. Au revoir.
À bientôt.